All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 4 of Soch 200. This week, we are getting into the topic of race and ethnicity. And this is another huge topic in the world of sociology. It's another one of these topics that, in and of itself, oftentimes an entire course is devoted to the subject. So instead of taking or reviewing race and ethnicity for a week, like we will do in this class, oftentimes in universities, it's an entire quarter or semester at least that's devoted to it. So it's a lot to kind of shrink in and fit into a 1 week time period, but we'll do the best we can. Before we move on to that topic, though, want to just provide some other updates. We are in week 4, so we have kind of few weeks now under our belt. Next week is essentially the halfway point of the term. So it's a good time to kind of see where you're at, see what you're missing, see where your grade is at and where you want it to be. And if you're in much more of a danger zone, if you're failing or in danger of failing, to really take ownership of that and look at where you're at and what you need to do to improve. And I'm here to help you with that. So as far as grades, those grades from week 3, I will be getting this afternoon. Hopefully, if not this afternoon, tonight, I'll start grading those, getting them in the grade book. I hope to have all grades finished by tomorrow night. There's always the possibility that I won't finish them until Wednesday morning, but tomorrow night's my goal. Office hours, we'll once again have it this week at 2 p.m. on Wednesday. Just want to remind everybody it's optional. I think most of you have gotten that message. And I also just want to remind you that if you cannot attend the 2 p.m. Wednesday session, but you need to meet with me in real time, that we can make arrangements to do so at a different day and different time that fits both of our schedules. So moving into this week's topic, the issue of race and ethnicity, we might as well just start with those two terms, race and ethnicity. Race tends to be kind of a biological construct. Ethnicity tends to be a cultural construct, where ethnicity tends to be the things like the way people dress and the kind of food they eat and the kind of music they listen to and the language they use and so forth, which oftentimes is associated with race. But for our purposes, we're talking about race in the context of society and in how that shapes society. And in America, we have a unique history. I don't know if I'd say unique, entirely unique, but we have a history in which racial relations are intertwined with the evolution and development of the country. And obviously, we're all aware of the Civil War. I think we're all aware that this was a country in which slavery was a legal institution into the 19th century. And, in many cases, decades, if not hundreds of years after it had been outlawed in other similar nations. And so that's kind of a foundational issue in our country, and that shapes everything that's come after. Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, even the recent protests with Black Lives Matter and after the George Floyd case. So a couple things we like to talk about in sociology, and going back to the early days of sociology, one of the most famous studies of race was done by a married couple, the Clarks, and the Clarks essentially set up a study in which they used dolls, and they had dolls, white dolls and black dolls, and they would show these dolls to young children, to young African American children and young white children, and they would basically ask them questions about the dolls. And so they would ask them, and these were like 5 or 6-year-old kids. They'd ask them, which doll do you consider the prettiest? Which doll do you consider the nicest? Which doll do you consider the baddest? Stuff like that. And so the white kids, generally, when they were asked to pick the prettiest or the happiest or the most popular, they would pick the white dolls. But when they asked the African American children the same questions, they would oftentimes also pick the white dolls. And so this kind of highlighted something that was talked about but really had not been studied, which is this internalization of racial attitudes, even at a young age. So even at a young age, these young children had internalized this notion that they were not as good or that they were inferior to somebody else based on the color of their skin. So the Clark studies were very famous. They've actually been replicated many times. They were replicated, I think, 10, 20 years ago with roughly the same results. And they were actually used, this study was actually used as in the civil rights cases that were argued before the Supreme Court in the 1960s. So that's a famous sociological study that relates to how we internalize these inferiority complexes and how those define our identity, even again from an early age. We also might want to talk about what we mean by prejudice and what we mean by discrimination. And prejudice is kind of a mental, cognitive process. It's how we think about the world. Discrimination is how we act. It's a behavior. And so we can be very prejudiced and not be discriminatory. So we might have in our mind, and when we're alone, we might have very prejudicial thoughts, and we might even speak in that way, but it doesn't mean we necessarily discriminate, although that's not always the case. So discrimination is an action. It's denying somebody the right to buy a home because of the color of their skin or something like that. So just to be clear, prejudice is a thought, discrimination is an action. And so when we talk about civil rights legislation, we're trying to remedy discrimination, which is an actual action, denying someone a loan, denying someone a right to live in an apartment, that sort of stuff. Denying or changing thoughts or the way we think, that's much more complicated. And we could make the case that we haven't done as great a job in that area as we have maybe in the area of discrimination. Okay, so in this week's activities, in your discussion, you're going to get into these theories of prejudice. Where does prejudice come from, essentially? We know we're not born with this. We're not born necessarily to be prejudicial. So where does it come from? And in part of this conversation, we bring up the topic of labeling, which is just what the name implies. It's putting a label on other people or other groups and then defining them based on those labels and behaving towards them based on those labels. We also bring up the concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy, which is when we basically have a thought or a belief and then we behave in a way that brings that belief to a reality. And so you're going to kind of comment on some of these theories, and that's going to be the basis of your discussion for this week. Your assignment for this week is going to be a little different. It's going to ask you to look at things more from a sort of macro perspective and look at how kind of global change happens in comparison with other nations. And so it's going to ask you to kind of look at the history of the United States in this context. And then how important do you think race and social class is now to be in America? So a couple things, again, related to race in terms of the activities that are going to be due this week. And I would also note we also have a quiz this week. So we have our second quiz this week. So don't forget about that. Okay, so I'm going to make this kind of quick today. I will see you all in the classroom this week. Hopefully I'll see some of you at office hours. And again, I'll be grading things over the course of the rest of today and tomorrow. So your gradebooks should be up to date by hopefully by tomorrow night. If anybody has any questions or if anybody needs to meet with me, just reach out and we'll set that up. And hopefully you'll have a great week. Take care.